In the summer of 1971, a group of young men, ordinary college students with ordinary lives, answered an advertisement that promised a simple study on prison life. What they could not know, what none of them could ever imagine, was that they were about to step into a psychological labyrinth where the boundaries of morality, identity, and humanity would blur beyond recognition. The building that housed them was a nondescript basement of Stanford University, transformed into a prison that would become a crucible for human behavior. Here, the line between the observer and the participant would dissolve, and in that dissolution, the darkest aspects of human nature would be revealed. The participants were randomly assigned roles. Some would be guards, entrusted with authority and control, and some would be prisoners, stripped of freedom, anonymity, and dignity. From the very first moments, the experiment demanded a surrender to structure, to hierarchy, to rules that seemed simple on paper but in practice were suffocating. Prisoners were arrested in their homes, fingerprinted, and blindfolded. Their identities were reduced to numbers, each one branded with a label that stripped away individuality and replaced it with submission. The guards, meanwhile, were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes, and a set of instructions that emphasized order, discipline, and control. As the days unfolded, the initial excitement and curiosity gave way to something far more sinister. The guards, once ordinary students like the prisoners, began to embrace their roles with unsettling intensity. They discovered the intoxicating thrill of power, the seductive ease with which authority could bend human will. Commands became crueler, punishments harsher, and the prisoners, in turn, began to internalize their roles as victims. Panic, humiliation, and despair spread through the simulated prison like a contagion, infecting every corner of the basement. By the second day, the first cracks appeared. Some guards began to invent arbitrary rules, subjecting prisoners to psychological torment that escalated beyond the scope of the study. Prisoners broke down emotionally, crying, begging, pleading for relief that did not come. The line between reality and simulation blurred. The experiment was no longer a controlled study but a live demonstration of human susceptibility to authority and situational pressures. And through it all, the researchers watched, some with fascination, some with unease, as the experiment spun further from their expectations. The transformation was rapid and haunting. Men who had laughed and joked in casual conversation now barked orders, enforced obedience, and relished in the suffering of their peers. Others who were assigned the role of prisoners became passive, withdrawn, some experiencing emotional breakdowns that left them trembling, mute, or catatonic. The psychological mechanisms that had remained dormant in everyday life were suddenly activated, exposed under the weight of an environment designed to exploit fear, conformity, and submission. No one had anticipated the intensity of the reactions. The experiment was scheduled for 2 weeks, but by the 6th day, it had spiraled beyond control. The ethical boundaries had been shattered. Researchers, including the experiment's designer, Philip Zimbardo, recognized too late the human cost of what they had unleashed. The basement, how a harsh glance, a sudden shout, or a minor punishment could instill compliance, obedience, and even terror. In those moments, the prisoners learned the fragility of dignity, how easily identity could be eroded when subjected to constant surveillance and arbitrary power. Solitary confinement became a tool not only of isolation but of psychological manipulation. Prisoners were sent to small, dark cells for infractions, no matter how trivial. Time stretched endlessly in these cramped spaces. Hours felt like days, days felt like weeks. The mind, deprived of normal social interaction and routine, began to fracture. Some prisoners became silent, their eyes hollow, their posture slumped, while others oscillated between rage and despair, screaming or sobbing in a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of control. The guards, intoxicated by authority, escalated their behavior. They invented rituals, humiliation games, and arbitrary rules to reinforce their dominance. Prisoners were forced to perform degrading tasks, sometimes standing silently for hours, sometimes addressing the guards with formal, submissive titles. The experiment revealed a horrifying truth. Given the right conditions, ordinary people could perpetrate cruelty and dehumanization with little provocation. The dynamics of power became addictive, a psychological high that fed on the suffering of others, and the guards could not, or perhaps would not, resist. One by one, the prisoner's sense of self began to erode. Personal boundaries, long-held beliefs about morality, and the concept of justice crumbled under the weight of relentless control. A sense of helplessness pervaded the environment. Every attempt at resistance was met with ridicule, punishment, or reinforcement of authority. The psychological stress was not an abstract concept. It was tangible, manifesting in the trembling hands, tear-streaked faces, and whispered pleas for mercy. The researchers, initially observers and recorders, became entangled in the unfolding horror. Zimbardo himself assumed the role of prison superintendent, a position that compromised his objectivity. He witnessed the cruelty firsthand and rationalized it as part of the study, failing to intervene until it became impossible to ignore. The lines between observer, participant, and perpetrator blurred. The experiment, intended as a controlled investigation into behavior, had become a live demonstration of human susceptibility to corruption and the intoxicating allure of power. By the fifth day, the intensity of the psychological breakdowns was undeniable. Some prisoners experienced severe emotional distress, refusing to eat, isolating themselves, or collapsing in hysterical episodes. The guards, meanwhile, became increasingly creative and cruel in their enforcement of rules. In one instance, prisoners were subjected to arbitrary punishments, stripped of their belongings, or forced to perform meaningless tasks for hours. The environment, designed to mimic a prison, had become a laboratory of suffering, revealing not just the vulnerability of individuals to situational pressures, but also the ease with which ethical constraints could dissolve. The unfolding events shocked even seasoned psychologists. Observing the rapid descent into dehumanization, humiliation, and emotional collapse, it became clear that the study was no longer about learning. It had become an exposure of the dark potential inherent in all humans. Authority, when combined with an environment of confinement and surveillance, proved capable of transforming ordinary individuals into agents of cruelty. And yet, within the prisoners' resistance and occasional acts of defiance, there remained glimpses of resilience, flashes of humanity fighting against the oppressive structure. As the sixth day dawned, the pressure within the prison reached a climax. The psychological tension was no longer contained. It seeped into every corner, every interaction, every glance. Guards acted with an almost ritualistic cruelty, their behavior no longer restrained by the veneer of civility. They discovered the intoxicating thrill of domination, the subtle satisfaction of bending others' wills to their own. It was a power that fed on fear, a feedback loop of control and submission that seemed unstoppable. Prisoners, their identities eroded, began to internalize the roles imposed upon them. Some displayed signs of learned helplessness, a state in which resistance felt futile and despair became the default response. Others oscillated between moments of defiance and crushing compliance, their emotional states a turbulent storm, dictated entirely by the whims of their captors. The experiment had transcended its original purpose. It was no longer a study, it had become a psychological crucible, revealing the fragility of moral judgment under extreme circumstances. One prisoner, reduced to a near catatonic state, refused to leave his cell. Another was forced to clean the latrines with his bare hands, humiliated while the guards watched. The guards, meanwhile, organized arbitrary punishments, invented ceremonies of submission, and enjoyed the spectacle of their own authority. Their behavior demonstrated a fundamental truth about human psychology. When empowered and unchecked, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty. The structure of authority, reinforced by an environment designed to strip away autonomy, revealed the darkest recesses of human nature. Zimbardo and his team, still observing, began to grasp the full magnitude of what had occurred. The line between experimenter and participant had disappeared, and the basement prison had become a microcosm of societal dynamics stripped of ethical safeguards. The realization was chilling. Even well-intentioned individuals could be swept into a tide of cruelty, participation, and complicity when the conditions were right. The ethical boundaries that were assumed to be universal were exposed as fragile constructs, vulnerable to manipulation by circumstance, hierarchy, and situational pressure. By midday, the decision was made to terminate the experiment. What had been intended as a 2-week study was abruptly ended after 6 days. The aftermath left a haunting impression on everyone involved: the guards, the prisoners, the researchers, and the wider psychological community. The experiment was widely criticized, yet it also became a foundational study in understanding authority, obedience, conformity, and the dark side of human behavior. It forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable reality that situational forces can overpower morality, empathy, and individual conscience. The psychological scars, though temporary for some, were profound. Many prisoners reported long-lasting anxiety, shame, and a heightened awareness of the power dynamics that govern everyday life. Guards, too, reflected on the intensity with which they had embraced cruelty, often expressing shock at their own behavior. The study revealed the horrifying ease with which humans can perpetrate harm, not from inherent evil, but from circumstance, authority, and social pressure. Today, the Stanford Prison Experiment stands as a cautionary tale. It is a stark reminder that environments shape behavior, that power corrupts, and that human nature contains both light and darkness, often separated by only the thinnest of barriers. The basement prison at Stanford University is gone, but the lessons it revealed remain, a chilling testament to the depths of human psychology and the unsettling truth that, under certain conditions, any ordinary person is capable of extraordinary cruelty. The echoes of the prison lingered long after the experiment ended. The lessons were seared into the minds of all who participated, and the story became a mirror reflecting humanity's potential for darkness. The boundaries between good and evil, kindness and cruelty, obedience and defiance, were no longer theoretical. They were visceral, immediate, and undeniable. In the controlled chaos of that basement, ordinary men had become actors in a drama of power and submission, revealing truths that textbooks and theories had only hinted at. The Stanford Prison Experiment exposed the terrifying fragility of morality under situational pressure. The experiment revealed the terrifying reality that, given the right conditions, situational forces can overpower conscience, empathy, and rationality, transforming ordinary people into instruments of harm or victims of circumstance. The story of the Stanford Prison Experiment continues to captivate, disturb, and educate. It serves as a chilling testament to human psychology, a cautionary tale about power, authority, and the delicate balance of morality. Its lessons remain relevant not just in the context of laboratory research, but in the world at large: schools, workplaces, institutions, and societies. Anywhere hierarchy, obedience, and situational pressure intersect, the echoes of that basement in Stanford remind us of the darkness that can emerge when vigilance falters and ethical boundaries are ignored. And so, the legacy of the Stanford Prison Experiment endures. It is a reminder, a warning, and an invitation to look inward, to examine the shadows within ourselves, the conditions that shape our behavior, and the choices we make when confronted with authority, power, and moral dilemmas. The experiment may have ended after 6 days, but its psychological imprint stretches far beyond, a haunting reflection of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The basement prison is gone. The uniforms, the mirrored sunglasses, the numbers on doors, these have all vanished into history. Yet the experiment persists in our consciousness, a dark mirror that reflects our potential for both empathy and brutality. It asks a question that resonates across time. In the face of authority, in the presence of power, and under the weight of circumstance, what would you do? How far would you go? And in that silent, unspoken answer lies the most unsettling truth of all, that within every person, the capacity for darkness waits, often dormant, but always present, ready to emerge when the world creates the conditions for it.